So let's talk a little bit about media plans and your SWOT analysis. So the first things first, I will mention if you're a little unfamiliar with a SWOT analysis, some of this is kind of common jargon for some of you. If you've taken a marketing class before, you are probably well aware of this particular acronym that's being used here. So it's for any kind of organization. This is your marketing plan for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And typically, again, these are things that should be well known within the marketing universe, as well as advertising. We constantly go over them, but if you're not familiar, that's okay. I do want to mention a few things before we get started with it. You have to excuse me. A van just went by with a siren, so I got a little distracted there. For SWOT analysis, though, we're mainly focusing on two main things here. First is internal and external. First is internal of the organization, and the second is external. So when you look at a lot of your strengths and weaknesses, these are things that are internally based of your particular company. So the strengths, obviously, things you do right. Weaknesses are things that can be improved on. Even though there are certainly external weaknesses, so if there's a saturated market or an overcrowded market, it would be another word for, that can be a weakness to what you're trying to sell. So think of like something like a soft drink, is that they've got a strong competitive market, which may pose as a weakness to your particular brand. Whereas opportunities and threats usually look at the external in terms of the things that you can do to improve your business, and partly based on those weaknesses, as well as threats, which primarily look at competition and what they're doing and why that's a threat. In particular, for Snapple, one of the threats, this was just an old client we worked with, one of the things that Snapple talked about was they were just having a poor perception of juice in the first place. So juice sales have gone down over the past couple of years, and so they were saying that's a threat. So it's not just a threat to Snapple in general. This is a threat to any kind of organization that sells juice in this case. So those are very important to consider when you start to look at the notion of threats in this case. And so some of the breakdown of this, when we get into it, we start looking at strengths, and these are statement of facts concerning the brand. So anything that is involved as a positive, this is what you'll formulate in terms of your strengths. And for your assignment, I'll probably want you to start out in terms of your brainstorming to like 10 or 12 strengths that you might be able to think of that really works with your product, and then narrow it down. It's kind of the same in regards to journalism. It's always better to start big and then redefine and condense your information in terms of bringing it to a more consolidated strength. You also want to make sure that those strengths are uniquely different from one another. So these statement of facts concerning the brand, a easy track to fall into is to have a couple of different strengths that you have that seem really similar. You want to differentiate those and maybe even consolidate them and put them into its own separate category. But typically, when we get into strengths, and for the plans book for this class, I'll only want 3 or 4 for each category. So in essence, it's not a whole lot of writing. However, I do want you to start big and then consolidate into something much more condensed. Weaknesses, these are not goals and statements about the brand, so don't address that at all. But what they're trying to say in terms of what your book was going for is that the goals and statements start talking about your opportunities. Those are the things that you want to do in terms of bringing in goals. However, weaknesses, these are the kind of things that we propose that So, like anytime you're working with a weakness, it's just a statement of fact to say, this is what we've been doing wrong. This is what the market's like. This is what our brand is having problems with. Um, and the thing is, any one of these, in terms of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats, can be used for media. So you look down under threats. It can be used for media, even though it's typically used for marketing. And this is one of the reasons why I had you all go in and have kind of a competitor as well as client analysis to kind of look at what everybody's doing. Where is your biggest media presence? Where are you lacking? What is strongest? What is weakest? What's an opportunity that you could use? What are the threats of other competitors? These are all based on that SWOT analysis. So let's look at, for this case, I'm going to look at Ocean Spray. So this is a little common for what we're doing for the National Student Advertising Competition. I'm not going to mention a whole lot of what they're doing specifically unless you're doing the client. So if you're starting to look at Ocean Spray as a client, I might just talk about small things that are mentioned in common place, so kind of public forum if you want, and I'll show you a little bit about that in terms of what's called Info Scout, in terms of what's going on here. So marketing strategies, first and foremost, consider your 4 P's: price, promotion, placement, and product. Again, this is all based on marketing stuff that you've probably already done before. For a lot of you, market size is going to be significantly different from one company to the other. So some of you are doing major international organizations, and some of you are doing local within, Avery County or Watauga County. They're very small market size. You also want to consider methods of advertising history. What has been used, what works. And you might say to yourself, we don't really have a history. And if that's the case, you may say that that's a weakness, but you also may say that this is an opportunity to say, I haven't really had much advertising, and therefore, the sky's kind of the limit. I have pretty much an open ceiling to work with. But if you have done good advertising in the past, so let's say you're one of those international organizations, you might want to say, and you can use Ocean Spray, is that there's a lot of positive valence concerning some of their advertising, especially with the Gentleman in the Bog. They are primarily very positive in terms of mascots for a brand, and people, for the most part, know who they are. They enjoy them. They're very charismatic and have a good dry sense of humor. You also want to consider things like what is the consideration for your product. So if it's new, that's obviously can be a major opportunity for you. Again, sky's kind of the limit. Versus if you're an old company, this was where Snapple, in this case, was kind of old and declining. A lot of people were just saying that this was a kind of a ho-hum brand. We've drank it for years. However, it's not exciting. It's not fun. There's a lot of other juice companies out there, but you might also consider ones that are new and upcoming and doing something really interesting. You also want to consider your market share and awareness, which you've already done to some extent. So breaking down those totals, and this is good for pie charts. So if you've got the social media for your clients as well as your competitors, you can break that down and say, what is the media share in social media? So I know a lot of you have talked about social media in the sense of we're not doing enough of it. So this is obviously a weakness, but again, can be a statement of opportunity to say we can promote within social media. Budget is going to be another thing that we talk about. If you are doing a small company, I will want you to ask what their budget is. So after the midterm, we'll talk a little bit about bringing in a realistic budget for you to work with for your particular client. And if we can break it down on a spot map. Now, some of you, again, for those local We're not going to have spot maps. This will just be contingent for those who are working on projects that require it. So again, if you're just working in West Jefferson or Lenore or Hickory, spot maps aren't really going to be beneficial in this case. The other thing is the competitive consideration. And you'll start to see kind of a theme of why I've had you do the things that you've done so far. Who are your primary and secondary competitors? You also might want to look at aspirational competitors, and they may not necessarily be competitors. You might just see a brand that's just doing a lot of really cool stuff in terms of their media usage, and say, is that something that I can aspire to, that I can do something along those considerations? And it's just food for thought. And what's their share? So we can look at that through social media metrics, content analysis research. This is all stuff that we've more or less done. A lot of it has a much more deep meaning to it. But without seeing their websites, you're not going to know them completely. So we go with some of the numbers that we can see. Other things we can look at is how unique is your brand in consideration to other competitors. And if we say our brand is extremely unique, it does a lot of really interesting things, it goes up against the grain of what traditional standards are, that's awesome. But you might also see that your brand isn't unique at all. And that could be kind of a threat, because you're not doing anything different from any other competitor. How much are you spending? You may not have that opportunity to spend as much as some of your competition. So some of you are doing local restaurants, and you would say to yourself that our competition are some of these chain restaurants that we could not even feasibly touch in terms of competition spending. But again, that's okay, because competitions will use different media vehicles, and that may be an advantage to you, that you can do something a little bit different in terms of the way you promote something. And then what time frame do competitors spend money? I like to look at marketing in Boone, for example. And Boone and Banner Elk and Blowing Rock is a very interesting market. It's a very split-based market that you have. And again, if you're from here, if you've lived here, if you spend time in the high country, you probably already know this, but typically it's a lot of very wealthy people from typically Florida that come up here during the summer. They spend a lot of money. They look for a nice, cool environment. They look for some privacy. They look for the nice views. They look for hiking. But they also look for a good meal. And this is why industries around here. So one of the better restaurants in terms of if you want to give up a second mortgage for your house is the Artisanal. It's a very high-class restaurant. I've been there once or twice, not very often. Under very, very special occasions do we go there. Because it's extremely expensive, but they're only open in the summer because they know that once the winter comes around, there's a whole different market of people that come in. And one of the best examples that I can illustrate is through Bella's. Bella's has two locations in Banner Oak and Boone, and they're both pretty successful. And the one in Banner Oak stays very successful, especially during those summer months, because they can serve high-class Italian meal, like a pasta dish. But once the winter rolls around, you have skiers that are coming in that are from Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, that kind of thing. Most from the southeast. But what's interesting is, in terms of the Boone market, is that if you've ever been skiing before, you know that it's pretty darn expensive. And you think of, let's see, I've got to rent skis for myself, maybe a spouse, children, maybe guests. So ski rentals are not cheap, neither are lift tickets. neither is lodging. And so all these expenses kind of pile up. And the one thing that you think about is, I don't want to spend, $52 for lobster tail. So Bella's says, okay, we'll just have these big New York style pizzas. And it's one of the reasons that they've stayed in business as long as they have, because of this Boone marketing time frame in terms of how it works there. So again, think about how the market works in terms of where you primarily put yourself. So also what kind of sales promotions are used, and you can see traditional, non-traditional, digital media, mobile, social. I put how crazy is your competition, because some of these brands, I like looking at North Face, for instance. Their non-traditional advertising to digital strategies are exceptional, and they do extremely good work in terms of promoting both of them. So again, how crazy is your competition? And if you're Patagonia, you may look at North Face and say, wow, they're doing a lot of really interesting stuff in terms of combining digital with non-traditional. So, and these are all part of your media mix. So if you're confused about media mix, this is where you start on it. So this will be the last one I cover over today. In terms of your second SWOT proponent here, and a lot of this stuff is something I've talked about. What is your current big idea for your company in particular? So a big idea is pretty simple. A big idea is a slogan that defines your entire campaign. So we know this with McDonald's for the longest time was I'm loving it. Nike's been just do it. Chick-fil-A has been eat more chicken, spelled all wrong. So again, copy, slogan, headline, look at previous attempts at their advertising and what are the patterns. You want to see if you have low involvement versus high involvement for Taylor Strategy Wheel in terms of their creative. Are they ritual versus transmission? Again, these are all things that we need to be considering in terms of what have you done in the past. So it may be that you're doing a restaurant and it's just, this food looks good. Or you want to promote the family ideology of groups come here to dine in with family and friends, and make it kind of a social routine, if you will. So why does creative influence media planning? And some of this has to do with consulting research. So we do marketing accounts, copy testings, etc. of this consultations. So, one of the opportunities I've had as a limited consultant is to say that a certain brand should promote their product in this particular location. So it wasn't in Boone Banner Elk, it was actually in Fargo. I won't go into the details because, always want to protect the client. But how do your users feel about your product? So case of Snapple, again, they felt it was old. They felt that it's primarily catered to an older demographic. It wasn't new, it wasn't exciting, it was there, it was within the market, but outside of their heartland, which in case their heartland was New York City, it's not really well known. For Pizza Hut, they looked into it to say their menu was extremely complex. They were having a lot of complexity where simplicity really worked for them. They had done a lot of things that weren't working, that had once worked in the past in terms of their identity. And you can think about this in terms of client investigation with Ocean Spray. What do people think of Ocean Spray in this case, or your client? I know some of you are doing Ocean Spray as a client, which is why I brought that one up in particular. So target markets, and you'll notice that I put up here in terms of consumer demographics, this is actually based in terms of InfoScout. This is now granted you can pay to do this, but this is a bit of free data that I was able to find. So I used Ocean Spray specifically, but again, to protect the client a little bit, I wanted to just show some stuff that was on public forum. So in this case, we've talked a lot about index numbers, for instance, and we mentioned that it's 100 and better is what we're looking for. So we notice that in the consumer demographics, we have a very strong presence of male purchasers over the age of 45. Particularly, they are either Hispanic or a strong contingency of African Americans. There's no kids under $20,000 and advanced degrees or some college or a college degree. So it's interesting where you sit there and say, why this particular demographic in terms of what's being represented? Now, one of the things I looked up, again, I may have mentioned this before in this class, is the ideology of prostate cancer and why that might come into play in terms of, 45-year-olds and up African American males, in this case, in terms of being twice as likely to unfortunately have prostate problems. So in this case, and having a very strong education means that the people who would be most invested in this would probably do the research and say, hey, cranberries are pretty good for things like urinary tract infections of prostates. However, for a target audience, you may sit there and say, okay, this is who is typically buying it. Maybe I want to do something different, and which is the case for a lot of different companies that I've worked with in the past. They say, we want to work with millennials. We want to work with Gen Z. And so in the case of Juice for Snapple, they were like, we want to go for a much younger audience to present this material to. So that's all I'm going to cover over today for the time being. I'll cover more of this tomorrow, as well as I'll talk a little bit about Media Flight Plan as well. But that's the consensus that I'll bring in today for target audiences and a little bit of SWOT analysis. Like I said, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope you all have a great day. All right, thanks.